This is the first of three forums held out of Sacred Heart University that is looking very particular at what we're experiencing right now in the Catholic Church, the death of a pope, the burial of a pope, and the election of a new pope. So this is all part of the pattern. We're going to have three of these live forums, one dealing today about the pontificate of Francis, the recently deceased pontiff. And then we will have a forum specifically as we look at the candidates or papabile, those cardinals that are actually conceived of as possible popes. And then we will have a forum right after the election when we know who the new pontiff is. So we've got a tripartite structure here that covers us from the legacy of a now dead pope through to the contenders, ending with the election. That's what we're going to be doing. Okay. My guests, I guess, are Dan Rober. Dan is an associate professor at Sacred Heart University, and he is the chair of the Department of Catholic Studies. Michelle Loris is an associate dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and she's the director of the Catholic Center at Sacred Heart University, and Charlie Gillespie. Charlie is the director of the Pioneer Journey and an assistant professor in the Department of Catholic Studies. They're all prominent figures in Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart University, and they're all excellent folk. I'm Michael Higgins. I'm actually, I guess, the oldest here. I'm an emeritus professor, and I've just published a book on Francis called The Jesuit Disruptor. Okay. We've got a few questions to discuss today, but I want to start off with a slight departure from our anticipated script. And that's this. We buried the Pope. The ceremony was shown all over the world. Millions, probably, perhaps even billions, watched this in part or in its entirety. I had the privilege, well, I suppose a privilege in a way, from 2:45 in the morning on to provide color commentary in Toronto for the CTV network. But I want to get your reactions to this because I think the overwhelming reaction is great show. But I have a few reservations myself, and I just want to know what you thought of. We start with the dead Pope, and then we'll move into the legacy. So what was your reaction, if you saw it? And I suspect you at least saw part of the ceremony. What did you think of the funeral mass of Pope Francis? Start with you, Michelle.
Okay. Well, I did not see every single part of it, but I did see a good deal. I thought Cardinal Bautista Rey's homily was just moving, excellent. It hit the pulse of who Francis was as Pope, what his legacy was. And I thought his homily moved or suggested where the church should and might continue to go with the next Pope. The other thing that I was moved by were the throngs of people who came and were grieving for the loss of Bergoglio or of Francis. They loved him. And I think they loved him because, in my mind, not that Francis wasn't intellectual and not that he wasn't a very savvy individual. He was trained by the Jesuits, but he was also raised in the Latin American culture and the Latin American church. And I think he led with his heart. You know, his last letter to us was De Lexit Nos, and it was about how the heart is the core of who we are as human beings and the source of our love. And, you know, we at Sacred Heart have been actually reflecting on how this document, how this encyclical about the Sacred Heart of Jesus relates to Sacred Heart University. But I think it speaks to what Francis did, how he led as a pope. He led from the heart. He led with the heart. And I would say it was with the heart of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Francis read the signs of the times through the lens of a gospel of love and mercy. And the people knew that. He was genuine. He was human. He was spontaneous. He made mistakes. He touched people with his hands. He kissed their feet. people loved him. He talked off the cuff. I saw one speech where he's talking to the Latin American about family, and he said something like, "And we all know when the dishes fly," and anybody could resonate with that when there are fights. If you're Latin American or if you're Italian, you could resonate with when the dishes
A
fly.
little different if you're Irish. Dan, what do you think?
Sure. So I think a useful frame of comparison is to compare the funeral of Francis to the funeral of John Paul II in 2005. That funeral, after almost 27-year pontificate, was very much at the time the funeral of a world historical figure, right? Of somebody who had quite deliberately and also really kind of strode across history and made important impacts in terms of especially the end of the Cold War. His legacy has become more complex over time as we've gotten a historical perspective on it. But at the time, it was certainly, right, this is the person who has kind of stood over the world for 27 years and had an impact in various ways. The funeral of Francis was the funeral of a beloved pastor. It was the funeral of somebody who, as Michelle just said, touched people's hearts, right? So there was a very deliberate focus on bringing forward people from marginalized communities who Francis had made an impact on. I also think the really interesting additional element to this funeral that hasn't been seen in a really long time at a papal funeral was the procession to St. Mary Major, right? That the funeral didn't end by going back into St. Peter's Basilica, right? Back into the Vatican, but it's one that went out into the city, right? Into Rome. And I've written about Francis as an urbanist, right? As somebody who loved the city. And how appropriate, right, to have this procession to another one of the major basilicas of Rome to bury the Pope.
Thank you, Dan. Charlie, your reaction.
I think this was a fitting conclusion to the papacy of Francis because he was such a master of using gestures as a way of adding to what his teaching was going to be as pontiff. And I think we saw in this funeral, as Dan just pointed out to us, that beautiful procession from St. Peter's Square to Santa Maria Maggiore. And in the procession, we see this simple wooden coffin, much in the same way that when Pope Francis was elected Pope and he comes out on the balcony and simply greets the crowd with Buonasera, we see in saying goodbye to Pope Francis this movement of a simple coffin through the streets of Rome to a church where he prayed at the end of every pilgrimage when he went out to the peripheries of the world to rest in a simple tomb that he instructed the church to label simply with the name Francis. I think what we saw there is another gesture that Pope Francis wanted his legacy to not then be loaded with all of this gilding and pomp and circumstance, but a reminder that he wanted to go out from the church, as Dan so beautifully said, out to where the people are. And I think that was a very fitting element of his papacy that we even saw in his funeral.
Yeah, certainly images matter, gestures matter, symbols matter. You know, I was watching, I covered the previous two popes and their funerals as well. And certainly there are qualities in the Francis funeral that are different. It was more simplified, of course. We know that he chose one coffin rather than three. We know that there was no catafalque or bier, that he was on level ground for people when they came to pay their respects. But I have to tell you, I was conflicted afterwards. Because it seemed to me to be an image that actually was counter Francis, by which I mean, especially as you move into the Synod, Francis referred again and again to his preferred model of the church as the inverted pyramid. This wasn't the inverted pyramid. With all the heads of states and the monarchs and every cardinal and prelate within driving distance was there. If you looked at it visually, it was very much the old order. And the relative absence of lay people in any vicinity other than just simply worshiping and clapping, I found disturbing. I thought it was wonderful that we had that trip. It was the first time that the Pope had been translated from the Basilica to another. Leo XIII was translated to San Giovanni Laterano, and this was not until, I guess, Pius IX had there been a body taken to Santa Maria Maggiore. I thought that was the best part of the ceremony, frankly. That was a beautiful sight. People lining the Corso, lining the Imperial Way, lining that marvelous road, the Merulana, that connects St. John Lateran with St. Mary Major, and then being received by the people he loved. But you know, if you were coming from the outside and you spent a great deal of time being attracted to Francis and reading his work, the concluding ceremony of say, over which, by the way, he did not preside, okay, we know that, was very much the old way of doing things, solemn and sober to a degree. I I mean, I can see where the cardinal planners thought, well, you know, he's our head of state, so we have to invite all the leaders and whatnot. He's a major figure, absolutely. We need to gather the cardinals because he created them and they're his advisors. That's right. But we had more than that. We had a huge superfluity of clerics. They were everywhere. And there's no particular reason why lay people couldn't have distributed communion. And there are all kinds of things they could have done that it seems to me would have been more consistent with Francis. Having said that, I don't want to sound churlish, but because much of it was actually quite moving. I agree with Michelle. It took me a while. At first, I thought Cardinal Ray was basically giving us a resume or CV of Francis. But then you began to see that the tone was different. The tone was more pastoral and affectionate. So if you wait upon his words, it's better than if you just listen to them. But I wanted to start this because you know, in the old English tradition, the Pope is dead, long live the Pope, right? So now we have a dead Pope, and now we have a new Pope coming. So we're in the interregnum. We're waiting for the new Peter to arrive, and then we'll talk about that next week. But right now, given that we have buried Francis, given that that he was an extraordinary figure who in so many ways humanized the papacy, I want to ask you this opening question about Francis. Was he a flash in the pan? Is he an odd figure, an exception, an aberration, a momentary nostalgic trick that takes us back to John the 23rd, or really has he changed things? What do you think?
I don't think so. So I just briefly, I don't think so because the cardinals, many of the cardinals. Now I get that there are a small group of cardinals who are very anti-Francis and are more conservative, but I would say largely the cardinals who are going to think about the next pope are imbued with a lot of Francis's thinking, his vision of developing a pastoral church, of opening the church, of bringing the gospel of love to the people, moving to the periphery. They may not be thinking of it as widely or as deeply as Francis did, or he was a maverick in many ways, and as you point out, a disruptor. But and the other piece is that Francis touched the people, and I think that has to have some bearing on where the church will go, or at least I have to say I hope so. So I don't think, and the documents that we can talk about maybe with another question, but the documents that he left us. So just very quickly, I don't think he will be a flash in the pan. I think the cardinals will be thinking, or a number of the cardinals will be filled with that vision of Francis.
Good, thank you. Dan?
So I'd like to, as we think about that, I think it's really important to think about how we got Francis in the first place, right? Which was partially the kind of open conclave that the resignation of Benedict XVI allowed for, right? Precisely a conclave where you did not have the papal funeral, you did not have the need to heap praises upon the predecessor, and thus ensure some kind of continuity in a sense, psychologically. Right, but rather you had a resignation that opened a space for a break and a new way of thinking. And this is in keeping, I think, really with, if you look at, and if you believe in the Holy Spirit as being involved in this process, again, through all the political machinations, through everything else. But all you have to do is think back to the conclave that elected John the 23rd, right? These are all cardinals who have been appointed by Pius XII, who had a very long papacy that seemed to signal a certain way that the church would always be. I would also really like to point to the first conclave of 1978 and to the election of Pope John Paul I, because Albino Luciani, as Pope, embodied a lot of the same style and values that Francis did. His pontificate was cut short, and I don't want to get into any more about that, lest we get into tinfoil hat territory, or even worse, Godfather Part 3 territory. But I think if you look at the historical pattern, right, that election is pretty significant in terms of seeing the way that it's not unusual for conclaves to play out in these kind of reforming ways. I think at this point, we may end up seeing some stabilization for various reasons that we can talk about. But I don't think he was a flash in the pan.
Okay, good. Charlie, what do you think?
I think this is an interesting question because there are certain elements of the Bergoglio pontificate that I think are flashes in the pan. We talked a lot right after Pope Francis was elected about the so-called Francis effect, that it was going to flood people back into the churches. And I think that while there was an initial enthusiasm, that level of a sudden return of organized religious organizations of being where spiritual life is in the present, we know hasn't borne out in time. With that said, though, I think there's something about your question that's really helpful, because it says that it was perhaps a momentary nostalgic trick of recycling John the 23rd. And I think that that's a great way to think about Pope Francis, because this was our first pontiff who really came into his own in the era of Vatican II. So there's a sense that having a program out of the Vatican from the highest offices of the church that are putting Vatican II's sense of what it means for the church to be in the modern world at the center of Catholic life, that made it feel at times like a throwback, when in fact, I think what Pope Francis was giving us was a vision of how this ancient church can move forward in light of the insights of that important council from the 60s. With that said, I do think that there are elements of Pope Francis's pontificate that are going to linger, and they're going to be incredibly important moving forward. Here is a pope that gave us the language of encounter for what it means to see God in our encounters with one another and in the world. A pope that formalized in magisterial and papal teaching what it means to think about human fraternity around the world and to see interreligious engagement as not optional, but essential. And I think most importantly, Pope Francis took a strain of concern for the earth and our common home as something that Catholics have always had as an element of our belief, faith, life, and thought, and brought it to the center of what the church needs to be concerned about in its social teaching. So where Pope Benedict may have brought Hildegard von Bingen to be a doctor of the church, so we can think about the idea of how ecology has always been a part of the tradition, Pope Francis brought those questions to Laudato Si to say it's not just to listen to the cry of the earth, but also to the cry of the poor. And I think that those elements of shifting our language and how we talk and encounter the world, those are going to be a real lasting element of his legacy.
I think that's right. I also think, the point Dan had alluded to, and in part Michelle as well, about the temperament or the personality of Francis. There are pieces both of Roncalli and of Luciani in him. You remember, although John Paul's first reign was very brief, as Dan indicated, less than a month, he was a guy with a taste for literature, and he loved jokes. And both Francis and John the 23rd were men who love literature and they love jokes. So there's something humane about their presence and their quality. They're populists in the good sense of the term, not in the sense that we've become terrified by, but in the good sense of the term. But here's a puzzle. And I was thinking as you were talking about this, all three of you. At the end of the funeral, I didn't hear, And I checked with our stringers and our correspondents. I didn't hear Santo Subito. Now, when you consider he's the most popular pope we've had in a long time, and at the death of Terravodiva, that sound, Santo Subito, that erupted from the crowd, Saint now, okay? And the sustained applause, greater than Francis received. And I think the numbers actually are greater than Francis had. Now, that's an issue to talk about, and we can't be reduced to quantitative factors, admittedly. But I think it does raise an issue around certain things. I mean, we could be cynical and say that Cardinal Dziwisz planted people. He wasn't cardinal at the time. He was archbishop, but he planted people in the crowd to scream Santo Subito. Yeah, of course, that's possible. It's probably even likely. But it would have had to generate a whole surge of like feeling, right? So this very popular Francis, taken along the papal way, translated to another basilica, I didn't hear that. And I found that puzzling for a pope that we continue to call the most popular pope that we've had in a very, very long time. But let me transition to the next question, because it's actually connected. Francis spoke to the world, and the world listened to him. It also spoke to him, and we saw that in terms of the global representation that was in Rome, right? How do you think that worked? Why did the world attend to Francis in ways it never did to Benedict? Was it simply style? What do you think?
No, not just style. I think, his whole pastoral theology is something that, you were talking about it before, was exhibited in what I call his sacramental gestures, right? I like to, I know you said gestures before, but I call them sacramental gestures. And those are, the ones in embracing the disfigured man, kissing and washing the feet of prisoners, touching every child and blessing every child he could. The apostolic journeys that he took. The first one was what, Lampedusa? And there he is saying the church must go to the margins. It must go to the periphery. It has to go to the people who are suffering. The apostolic exhortations and the last work, the Fiducio Supplicans. But those documents speak about his pastoral way of being with people. And so in addition to those things and the way he was when he was with other human beings, the encounter that you were talking about, Charlie, the accompaniment, the touching them, the actually physically touching them. I mean, Benedict was a very intellectual, incredible theologian, but just didn't have that charismatic personality style that Francis did. And I think Francis's personality and his style, his charismatic way of being, is partly from who he was as a human being. I think, he was like that as a priest. I think he was like that, when he was a cardinal. It's just who he was. He touched people. So, you're saying what's the effect of why the outpouring? I think they saw a man who was genuinely humble, who was genuinely loving and caring and warm, who was spontaneous, who was real.
That raises a good point, and maybe Dan and Charlie can respond specifically to this, because Michelle, I think, has highlighted a very important point here. But if you look at the biographers of Francis, and I'm technically not, my book is a portrait of a pontificate, but if you look at the biographies, people like, in English at least, Ivory and Vallely and Burns and Collins, there are several of them. One of the things that's underscored again and again is the experience of his Cordoba exile. That Francis actually, all the things that Michelle wonderfully encapsulated here in terms of his current personality were suppressed in those early years. He was known for his rigidity. He was known for his inflexibility. He wasn't tactile. He was withdrawn and he was fearful. And he talks about this himself. This is not somebody coming in and saying this is about Francis. Francis talks about this because, of course, he has that marvelous gift for transparency and regularly referred to himself as a sinner. So he doesn't disguise any of this. And even in his autobiography, he doesn't. So he experienced conversion. He learned something about himself that changed him. So that when he goes to Buenos Aires as Cardinal Archbishop, first as auxiliary, then Cardinal Archbishop, he's on the streetcar, he's living in a small apartment, he doesn't live in the Episcopal Palace. Already those qualities that came to fruition on the Tiber were already there in Argentina. But there existed a Bergoglio before that, right? Mm-hmm. So we all have moments of great epiphany and experience and conversion, at least I hope we do. And that begins to allow us to see things and maybe change. And that's one of the wonderful things I think about the Francis pontificate is that it is a pontificate that's not fearful of change.
Mm-hmm. That's what he brought to the church. He understood that individually, I think, in himself, that the human person grows, changes, develops. If that's a kind of conversion, a turning. And I think that's what his whole pastoral way was to do that with the church, to bring, I think, what was his statement when he first became Pope? The self-referential church,
yes,
right, that got him elected. It hides Jesus behind the walls. And I think there's another sentence that goes with that, and that when people are too self-referential, when institutions are, it leads to a kind of illness. And I think his opening up, and he saw that probably in himself. He was of an age where that kind of wisdom does come to the human person. And I think, so much of his work was to do that, open the doors of the church, that Vatican II vision, yes, through the lens of a gospel of love and mercy, right? That's how he read the signs of the times, with love and mercy.
Yeah, I agree. Dan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, Michael, I'd like to connect a few different points that you've been making that I think connect to this. Because I see going on, and I don't want to talk about Bergoglio's conversion, but I want to talk about a kind of pastoral conversion of the papacy. And I want to draw a connection. I want to apply a hermeneutic of reform and continuity to Francis and Benedict on this specific point. So, and I also want to relate to the question of sainthood. To start with that, actually, Cardinal Ray, at the end of his homily, asked for Francis to pray for us.
He did.
That theologically is not something you ask of someone who you think is in purgatory. But on the other hand, one of the few American Catholics Francis is known to be an admirer of was Dorothy Day, who famously said, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily."
Yes.
And I think he would have resonated very deeply with that. I also think he canonized John Paul II in part to get the church out of the business of canonizing popes for a while. I do think that is something, and this is something many theologians have talked about also. In terms of the conversion of the papacy, so the travels and public kind of witness of John Paul II were very much bringing what I would call the authority of the church. And I don't mean that in terms of condemning or anything. I mean that in terms of moral authority, right? The assumption that the church had a kind of moral authority to bring to bear against the Soviet Union, against the Polish communists, right? Against various other regimes, right? That John Paul II wanted to confront. But at the end of the John Paul II years, right, during his long decline and during the latter part of that, it became very clear with the sexual abuse scandals that the church no longer possessed that moral authority in the public eye, that was not going to be credible. And electing a pope, John Paul III, in 2005, who attempted to continue that approach, to me would have been disastrous and would have had diminishing returns. So Benedict XVI, right, was somebody who in various ways, again, he was a professorial man, right? He was not somebody prone to the grand gesture, but in some ways was engaged in what, to borrow from sort of neoliberal HR speak, right-sizing the papacy, right? He was somebody who wanted to take the scale of the papacy down from what John Paul did in order to make it more manageable. And in so doing, put his own personal stamp on it in certain ways, right? Most famously in some of the kind of perhaps quirkier old papal dress items that he brought to bear, right?
Yes.
But his approach to the papacy, culminating in his resignation from the papacy, rather than being entombed within it, as he saw happen to John Paul II at the end of his reign, right? Where you had an unwell man still being pope and with really Machiavellian people controlling the Vatican, that could not happen, that the papacy could not be allowed to become this kind of sarcophagus. So Benedict's approach of making the papacy smaller, ironically, allowed Francis to take it back on the road with a different kind of witness, with a pastoral witness inflected by Vatican II, not expecting or assuming authority on the part of the church, right? But bringing to bear the mercy of Jesus on behalf of the church. So again, I think these things are connected, but in ways that if you just take them into ideological territory are not necessarily obvious.
I like the idea that, quite original on your part, Dan. I like the idea that Benedict would have seen the entombment of John Paul II in his own papacy, especially in the dying years. And so, his attempt to turn the papacy into an epic ministry, a universal epic ministry, and in great way, a fulfillment of his own struggles as a Polish cardinal, dealing with contesting ideologies that threaten the very existence of the church, his own highly dramatic presence and whatnot. These are all features of John Paul that in many ways we admire at the same time as we see the downside in them. I think Benedict certainly was not someone who saw the papacy in those epic and political terms. That is clear. But at the same time, what we face there, and these are the contradictions in the papacy, is that Benedict, who was a Vatican man, and we know had a positive mitigating effect on some of John Paul II's successes, particularly around Marian titles and also around retroactively making Humani Vitae a matter of ex cathedra dogma. Benedict moved against that, but dissuaded John Paul II. Wouldn't have been able to do that if he didn't have John Paul II's confidence. At the same time, he was in Rome almost as long as John Paul II. And many of the cardinals who worked with him in his age, like Bertone, but others as well, were part of that same machinery that made John Paul's pontificate very compromised near the end and made Benedict's papacy inoperable. One of the reasons why he was resigned, he tells us he's exhausted, but also we know, he was not in control. He had his butler in jail. Who puts their butler in jail? So there were serious issues of misgovernance with Benedict, and that deep malaise was responsible in no small part for the cardinal electors to say, look, we got to scour house here. And so we need to go outside and we need to find somebody who's been absolutely untouched by Vatican intrigue. And so Bergoglio was the perfect object there. He'd already demonstrated his chops at the previous general congregation prior to the election of Benedict, right? So the struggle to make credible and relatable and again morally authoritative of the papacy, I think, was in no small part Francis' continuation of Benedict's own desire in that matter. I think you're absolutely right, Dan. But the crippling, ever crippling crisis of clerical sex abuse was not, in fact, satisfactorily handled by Francis. And so, several on his own commission quit. Many of his experts threw up their hands in despair. It took him a long time to clue into the enormity of it. What he began to do, and I think this is a constant, and I don't think it's Francis's failure, I think it's the failure of the structure itself and those around him. Nobody, no pope, railed against ecclesiastical careerism and clericalism more than Francis. And yet we still have it in abundance. So is this going to be a quality of failure of the Bergoglio legacy, or was the problem just too big? The pathologies too great for one pope to handle? What do you think? Start with you, Charlie, because we're going around again, then we'll go back to Michelle.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, Michael. And as I think about it, I do want to add one thing to the beautiful stuff that Michelle and Dan have put on the table, thinking about the lack of a Santo Subito chant, which is to remind us that it's been 20 years since the death of a reigning pontiff. And to put things in context, that I do think there's a palpable mourning for Francis, because all of us were surprised. He recedes from public life for a few weeks to be in the hospital, has a triumphant return on Easter Sunday to be with the people, and is then surprisingly no longer with us as of Monday morning. So I do also think that there may be a sense of shock. And that sense of shock and loss, I think, gets also to another shock of Francis to the system, which is to put clerical careerism and clericalism on the table as a problem for evangelization and for the credibility of the gospel. And I do think, Michael, that one of the reasons that responding to the sexual abuse crisis, responding to the scourge of colonialism in the church's history, responding to the evils the worldly church has done, I think that may have been a problem too great even for Pope Francis to have handled himself. I would start the conversation by saying what I think Pope Francis did was, from the highest levels of the church, suggest that grappling with clericalism is something that every Catholic needs to do. It's not enough for those of our brothers and sisters who are ordained and members of the hierarchy to critique what it means to be set apart, to lead us as those who have sacramental authority over the church. It is also not enough for lay people to simply take on co-responsibility to work alongside the church. It is actually the responsibility of the whole pilgrim people of God to recognize that this image of the church as a field hospital is not simply the space for the surgeon. It is the space for all of us to go and encounter those who are suffering. I do think that element of Francis's work will continue, but I think you're spot on, Michael, to say that that may actually have been one of the failures of this pontificate, to not just have it be a rhetorical opening of the church, but to also make central the response of the church to its failings.
I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Michelle. Go ahead.
Well, I just, so a long time ago when I was an undergraduate, I read a book. Dan, you're going to have to help me with the author, One Dimensional Man. And it really.
Is that Marcuse, isn't it?
Yes,
Marcuse,
Marcuse, right. And he really talks about how the system is so great that it's hard to create the kind of change. I think the kind of change that you're talking about, the structural clericalism, is so embedded in the church. But Francis made a big inroad, synod on synodality,
Yes.
right? He
Yes.
brings together men and women, clerical people and lay people, people on opposite sides of a position, and he works to sit them around a table to talk to each other. The other night when we had Father James Martin speaking here, Father Martin, who obviously is an advocate for the ministry to the LGBTQ, he said at first one of the people is a clerical from, I think, maybe sub-Sahara Africa, I'm not sure where, would not sit at the table with him, right?
That's correct.
But this is what Francis is doing. And if synodality isn't an attempt to move the church away from clericalism, I don't know what will be, and this is why I think it's so important that the church perhaps continue that. Now, the synods did not solve the problems, nor will they. The issues, let me say, about the role of women in the church, women as deacons, or saying that the sacrament of marriage is different than any doctrine. In other words, bringing gay people to marriage, to full sacramental marriage. That's not going to happen, and I understand that. But he brought people to think about that, to talk about that, to talk about priests being married, to talk about the possibility, divorced and remarried people being able to receive communion, and just to bring people in those conversations, those very difficult, as Dan has pointed out many times, to bring people together in those conversations, I think is a new way of being church, a new way of being church, a Vatican way, a Vatican II way of being church. That's pretty radical. And that is an attempt, I think, a way of changing clericalism a bit, which is why there's so much resistance on one side to the whole idea of synodality.
I
But
agree. Dan?
and he did reform the Curia. I mean, he didn't
Oh,
completely,
yes.
but he did make attempts to do that, and he made great changes in the Curia. And I think that was another way of trying to change the clericalism. But the clericalism, Dan and Michael could speak more specifically to its historical development and embeddedness. And when you have something embedded in a system like that, it's really, you have to take it out brick by brick by brick. And I think that's what Francis's work was. He was at the ground level in some ways, even though he had the grand vision of the synod. So, I think that next several popes, if they have in mind to change the clericalism, it will take more than one pope's term.
Oh, no, I agree. He began this, but I had a conversation with Tom Rees, and you will know him. He's an American Jesuit who had been actually censured by Benedict XVI, but anyway, he's now back fairly prominently on the Vatican scene. He's a political scientist by training, and he said to me at one point, because I said to him after the second session of the synod, I said, "Oh my God, Francis only made three really powerful interventions from the aula. Two of the three were he railed against the excesses of clericalism, or indeed clericalism, period. Right? Was anybody listening?" And I said to Tom Rees, "How are we going to implement any of this?" And he said, "Michael, one thing I learned as a political scientist is personnel is policy. If you don't have the personnel, it's not going to happen." Right? So you throw the question back to what was to me a signal moment in the early years of the papacy of Francis. He called together the faculty and the students of the Academia Ecclesiastica. That is the body in Rome, the college where they train the diplomats, the nuncios. And he told him what he wanted. He said, "I want men with the smell of the sheep. I don't want seminary rectors and prelatical secretaries and canonists and whatnot. I want the men with the smell of the sheep." That's not really happened to the degree that Francis wanted. So it goes back again to the resistance that Francis met. Yes, I think he quite successfully actually scoured much of the problem, got rid of much of the detritus that was part of the crisis in the Curia. I think he did that. But I think there are so many other dimensions to this that got in the way. And I'm not at all convinced that the nuncios bought into the model that he was, because when bishops, the Archbishop of New York, for instance, when he was asking for 3 auxiliaries, he drew his candidates from the traditional and conventional background. It was Francis's direct intervention that appointed 3 auxiliaries that were basically parish priests. Right? Now, he can't do that with 6,000 or 7,000 bishops. He has to have a bureaucracy he can rely on. Huh? So part of it, I think you're quite right. I mean, part of it is just getting it going, creating a culture of reverent listening and respect for the other, building this culture of encounter, because this is going to be a long project, implementing synodality, ridding the church of clericalism and all this kind of thing. And let's face it, those aren't doctrinal matters. I mean, Daniel, you're a theologian, you can correct me on this one, so is Charlie. But these are not matters of doctrine. These are matters of policy and pastoral strategy. I mean, Francis never changed a doctrine, added a doctrine to the canon of the church. What it is how you live that. and how you give it credibility. Anyway, I'm talking far too long. Dan, we've left you out of the orbit here.
Sure. So I want to say a couple things about this. I think one of the most important aspects of Francis vis-a-vis clericalism that doesn't get pointed out in the generic as much as it should is that everybody talks about Francis being a Jesuit, right? Which matters, right? He's the first Jesuit pope. Jesuits are religious, and for those of us familiar with religious priesthood and the secular or diocesan priesthood, right? These are quite different cultures. Religious, not exclusively, there are some very clerical religious, but by and large, male religious tend to be much more anti-clerical than diocesan priests. Now, there are certain kinds of privilege actually that are endemic to religious and not to diocesan priests, such as, not having to worry about paying one's own bills or any of that kind of thing. But I will say that this is very much reflective of his being a religious, right? He is a Jesuit, and then he takes the name Francis, right, which is another founder of a religious order, and one that, somebody who was not himself a cleric, right? I would point up as an example of this, also an interesting example of this, someone that Francis put forward for us, who is Oscar Romero. So Romero, of course, was the Archbishop of San Salvador, and part of the reason for his prophetic ministry that ended up getting him killed was that he had gone to seminary in Rome rather than to the diocesan seminary in El Salvador, and thus he was not part of the club of priests in El Salvador who were all kind of very supportive of the regime. So he, as somebody who was a man of fairly conservative temperament, comes back as archbishop, but doesn't have any friends, and becomes friends with a religious, Rutilio Grande, a Jesuit. And this is what radicalizes him. But basically, he becomes friends with the religious because that's who's available to be friends with.
Yes.
That's it. It's an example of somebody who was a diocesan cleric, but was radicalized into a much more anti-clerical stance and prophetic witness on behalf of the poor, precisely because of the witness of religious. Now, in terms of the clerical system, right, a lot of this is grappling with the legacy of the Council of Trent, right, and of its systematization of the diocesan priesthood, which was necessary at the time because so much of the kind of moral teaching around the priesthood, especially in the German territories, had not been ever really implemented. So the idea that clerical celibacy was mandatory was not exactly known to many people in Europe at the time of the Reformation. So that system has clearly, which worked for several hundred years with quite a bit of success, has clearly run out its time. It's worn out its welcome. But trying to redo the culture of the priesthood on the fly is very difficult. Especially while trying to maintain any kind of morale among the priests who are there. One of the complaints about Vatican II, right, is that I had a lot to say about bishops, had a lot to say about laity. The two groups that it didn't have as much to say to were secular priests and religious. And a lot of people left the secular priesthood and the religious life at around that time for reasons not completely related to that, but not unrelated to that either. Not completely separated from that either. So this is something that's in need of the kind of reform that was carried out after Trent with the setup of the diocesan seminary system. But it requires, and it's going to require the buy-in of bishops, cardinals, popes who were themselves diocesan priests to reform the system and to think about really kind of fundamentally re-examining how the church approaches priestly ministry. Not necessarily the sacrament of orders, but the ministry and the formation of priests.
That's right, and that's a point that Francis makes repeatedly. It's not the presbyterate that is the problem. The problem is the notion of the priesthood as a caste, an exceptional body with unique power and prerogatives and their abuse. And you're right, it's far more common among the parochial or regular clergy than it is among the religious. And we haven't had a religious pope for a couple of centuries, I think. I'm just trying to think who was the last one who who's religious. We've had a
I
couple of
believe it was
friends.
Gregory the 16th.
Who?
I think Gregory the 16th was the Camaldolese.
Was he? Okay. Well, that must have been a shock to the system. You're a Komodo monk. Next thing you're sitting on the seat of Peter. But anyway.
That's why he thought
Michael, I
railroads
just
would
want
work for
to.
the Senate.
Okay.
I just want to add one sentence to what you were saying before, that, you know, Francis needed to have developed a whole cadre of personnel. And I think some of the cardinals that he's appointed, and we at Sacred Heart have had about 6 of those cardinals here
Absolutely.
to speak to our students in our community. And my experience with these cardinals is that they do have some better understanding of the clericalism that exists in the church, and they themselves don't represent that clericalism. And I think, you know, I mean, we're only talking about the 6 cardinals that I met who came to Sacred Heart, but if Francis is appointed, you know, what, 2/3 of the cardinals, and
Yes.
they have some of that idea.
More than that, actually.
Well, okay, so then all I'm saying is if you need a cadre of people, of personnel to create policy, to make change, perhaps that is, you know, might happen with these men that he has appointed.
Could I just add
Like,
one?
you wanted to say something.
Okay, Charlie, and then we have to wrap up this forum because we're almost at an hour's length. It's been extraordinarily stimulating, but it will provide us with a transition for the next discussion about the contenders and whether they buy into the Francis ministry and legacy, particularly around synodality. But Charlie, you have the last word.
I think we're ending on what is the right question to ask about the legacy of Pope Francis. On the one hand, there were some profound doctrinal developments under the Francis pontificate, primarily among changes to how we think about the death penalty in Catholic social teaching. And that was an element of Pope Francis' teaching from the top down that created some of the difficulties he experienced with the rest of the Curia and indeed with many Catholics around the world. On the other hand, we're about to ask these questions about who's going to be next, and it really does raise for us, is synodality an ecclesial style, a way of listening and being church? Or is Pope Francis' successor going to think about forwarding this project of synodality as an ecclesial structure, a way in which we legislate and govern the church? And I think that's one of the big questions we'll have to consider in our next conversation.
I think that's right, and we will consider it in our next conversation. My name is Michael Higgins, and Daniel Rober and Michelle Loris and Charles Gillespie join me in the studio. Well, kind of studio, a virtual studio, to have the discussions that in this forum that it says a lot about Sacred Heart University's commitment to the Bergoglio legacy. These forums were established some time ago. They continue because they provide a platform for an intelligent discussion about the faith. And as you can see, there are points of convergence and points of subtle disagreement amongst the 4 of us. That's the way it should be. That's what synodality is about, actually. So we'll see you next week, I believe, and for part 2 of our forum on the reign and successor of Pope Francis. Thank you.